Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to the candlelit world of medieval monasteries, where ink smells stronger than the soup. Your back is already sore from sitting on a wooden bench, and your quill seems to have a mind of its own. You're a scribe, tasked with copying sacred texts in an age when books were worth more than cows. It's quiet. Too quiet. Except for the faint scratching of your neighbor's quill and the soft squelch of a snail? Wait, why is there a doodle of a knight fighting a snail in the margin of your manuscript? No, seriously. That's what we're doing tonight. You, a humble, overworked medieval scribe, are about to lose hours of your life drawing absurd battles between heavily armored warriors and squishy little gastropods. Why? That's what we're here to find out. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive this job, not because of the labor, but because your boss, the abbot, doesn't find snail jokes nearly as funny as you do. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing who's tuning in and when. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the scriptorium. The air is cool and dry, the stone walls doing little to keep out the evening chill. The place smells like ink, parchment, beeswax, and old wood. If you've ever wondered what a book feels like before it's bound and titled, this is it. Crinkly skin-like sheets stacked beside you, waiting to become wisdom. The benches are hard and uninviting. You adjust your ropes, hoping they cushion your spine just enough for a few hours of work. Your tools are simple: a sharpened quill, an inkpot that's already half empty, and a sheet of vellum so delicate that even your breath could wrinkle it. You dip your quill and begin. Latin letters flow from your hand like slow-moving honey. They have to be perfect. Mistakes mean scraping the parchment and doing it again, or worse, invoking the wrath of Brother Cuthbert who oversees quality control. You swear he hasn't blinked since 1278. You copy words with care, but your mind wanders. The margins call to you, those wide blank spaces running down the sides of the page. They're unofficially known among scribes as playgrounds, though no one would dare say that out loud. These margins are the one place where your imagination can live, quietly, without theological approval. And so it begins. A little doodle here, a swirl there. A bored scribe somewhere once drew a rabbit jousting with a dog. Another sketched a nun battling a cat. But then came the snails. You don't remember the first time you drew one. Maybe it started as a joke. Maybe someone dared you. But now, every manuscript you touch seems to include at least one armored snail confronting a brave knight in full plate. And you're not alone. Across Europe, across centuries, the same weird image keeps appearing in manuscripts. A snail, sometimes with a human face, squaring off against a knight. In some, the knight is terrified. In others, the snail wins. You tilt your head. Why snails? Why not something grander, like dragons or lions? Something heroic. Something less slimy? That's the thing. No one really knows. Historians still argue whether the snail was a symbol of sin, laziness, cowardice, or just a convenient little creature to mock authority. Some say the snail represented the slow, creeping threat of heresy. Others think it was a parody of the overly chivalrous knights, who were a bit full of themselves by the 13th century. It's one thing to charge into battle. It's another to charge into a garden slug. And then, of course, there's the possibility that scribes were just tired, overworked, slightly delirious. Imagine writing Bible verses for 10 hours straight with no coffee, no breaks, and no Spotify playlist to help you push through. A snail duel starts to feel like a very reasonable outlet. Sometimes, you're bold enough to draw a full scene, a knight atop a horse, lance extended, and across the field, a snail, helmet slightly too big, eyes on stalks, and an expression of smug defiance. Maybe you even add a little dust cloud beneath the snail, just to suggest speed. It's absurd. It's glorious. Your fellow scribes sometimes add to it. One draws a flag in the snail's hand. Another paints the knight's horse looking worried. Someone adds a snail audience, cheering from the margins. You smile. This is the kind of rebellion that leaves no trace on the record, except for the thousands of manuscripts where snails keep fighting knights, century after century. You stretch your fingers. The candles flicker. Somewhere, a bell tolls for evening prayer. You still have pages to finish, saints to copy, margins to fill. But for now, there's a knight on your page, staring down a snail. And you wonder who'll win this time. You shift on the wooden bench again, your spine now in full revolt, and squint at the tiny lettering you've just inked. The Latin feels endless, each line of scripture a perfect storm of loops, serifs, and uncrossed T's waiting to ruin your whole evening. But right there, in the margin, the drama continues. Your valiant little knight is now mid-duel, facing off with a snail the size of a cat, shield raised, dignity questionable. You chuckle quietly. It's not the first time tonight. The scriptorium around you remains a temple of silence, broken only by the distant clink of a bell in the abbey courtyard and the occasional muffled sneeze from Brother Anselm, who insists he's allergic to parchment. The walls are thick with centuries of quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in and muffles your thoughts until all you can do is let your mind wander. And wander it does, to the origins of this strange battle between mollusk and man. You wonder, could it really be satire? A commentary on the futility of chivalry? After all, knights weren't always gallant figures of legend. Sometimes they were just bored nobles looking for something to stab. In fact, during the 13th and 14th centuries, knights became somewhat inconvenient. They were expensive, politically messy, and not always obedient to kings or popes. A slow-moving, ridiculous enemy like a snail might be just the thing to poke fun at their inflated egos. One theory goes that the snail represented the Lombards, wealthy Italian merchants who lent money to Northern Europeans and were about as popular as taxes. Manuscripts often show knights triumphing over snails, and if the snail stood for a much-resented creditor class, that tracks. It's like medieval editorial cartoons, only with more armor and fewer mustaches. But here's where it gets murky. Not every snail looks defeated. In fact, some seem to be winning. There's one in a French psalter who looks downright smug as the knight flees. Others are seen casually climbing over helmets or carrying spears themselves. Are we still mocking something here, or admiring it? Historians still argue whether these illustrations were meant to amuse, provoke, or confuse. Maybe all three. Marginalia, the art of scribbling in the margins, was sometimes just that, art. Scribes had a lot of rules to follow, but nobody ever said what could or couldn't live in the blank spaces. And those blank spaces mattered. See, medieval books were handcrafted, painstakingly copied page by page, line by line. Illuminated manuscripts, like the ones you're working on, weren't just for reading. They were for worship, display, and occasionally showing off to your noble guests like, look, this Bible cost more than your castle. Each page was a canvas, and the margins? That was where a scribe's personality could peek through. Some included jokes, some drew monsters, some even used the margins to subtly criticize their patrons. Always risky, but deeply satisfying if no one caught you. There's a famous example from the Gorliston Psalter, where a knight readies himself for a deadly duel, only to face a grumpy snail with a sword. The snail is unbothered. The knight? He looks like he's rethinking his life choices. You glance at your own work again. You've added a tiny crown to your snail, just to imply he's nobility. Perhaps a duke, a gastropod of the realm. It's silly, sure, but also oddly poetic. In an era obsessed with hierarchy and order, a lowly creature like a snail becoming a martial threat must have felt like rebellion. And speaking of rebellion, let's talk about the monks. You're part of a monastery, which means your time is scheduled down to the minute. Morning prayers, midday meals, evening readings, and everything in between filled with writing, chanting, and trying not to fall asleep during Vespers. Life is structured, serious, and deeply pious. But that doesn't mean monks didn't have a sense of humor. Some scholars believe these snail duel images were simply jokes, a kind of inside joke among scribes who saw the absurdity of their own lives. You copy the heroic deeds of saints and martyrs all day, but inside you're wondering what would happen if a snail charged into battle. It's mental doodling, 13th century edition. Others argue the symbolism runs deeper. In Christian theology, the snail was sometimes seen as a symbol of resurrection. It vanishes into its shell and then reemerges. Some thought it unclean because of its slimy trail, Others admired its perseverance. But none of this explains why they're fighting knights. It's almost as if the image resists interpretation on purpose. Like the snail knows something you don't. You stretch again. Your neck pops in protest. The candles are burning lower now, and your stomach reminds you that dinner was mostly lentils and disappointment. The scriptorium's shadows are deepening, stretching long across the stone floor. You look back at your page. Your snail now has a tiny flag, a proud little banner that says Virtus et Viscera. You laugh softly, guts and glory. That'll confuse the next monk who reads this. From time to time, you think about the future. Will someone, centuries from now, find this page? Will they wonder, like you are now, why a noble knight of Christendom found himself in mortal combat with a garden pest? Maybe they'll laugh. Maybe they'll write essays. Maybe they'll make YouTube videos about it. But for now, your hand moves gently across the vellum, and the battle continues. One quill stroke at a time. Your wrist aches, your ink is running low, and yet, you keep going. Because now the duel has escalated. The snail has backup. A second one looms behind it, tiny eyes on stalks peering over a miniature siege engine. A catapult, perhaps, cobbled together from what looks suspiciously like a teaspoon and some bread crust. The knight, meanwhile, seems less valiant and more exasperated, like he just realized today's heroic quest includes getting slimed. You grin. By this point, you've copied 5 more verses of Psalms and added a tiny detail. The knight's helmet plume is drooping like a sad feather duster. A scribe's revenge? A little shade thrown at some overly proud noble patron? Or just the medieval equivalent of doodling in your math notebook during a lecture? Historians still argue whether these marginalia were acts of rebellion or just good-natured nonsense. Some scholars believe they reflect deeper cultural anxieties, mocking nobility, symbolizing slow but inevitable decay, or poking fun at rigid chivalric ideals. Others are quite content to call them what they appear to be, weird little jokes. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful, because in a world where books were sacred, expensive, and deadly serious, the margins became places of freedom. No one really policed what went in the corners, and monks took full advantage. You can imagine it. A group of scribes gathered for a quick break, munching dry bread, passing around gossip, comparing their favorite snail scenes. Did you see Brother Wilfred's last psalter? He gave the snail a little trumpet. Hushed laughter. One monk nearly snorts his soup. Of course, not all monks were quite so gleeful. The Benedictine rule stressed obedience, humility, and long hours of labor, which included copying texts without altering the sacred message. But the margins? The margins were a gray area, and gray areas are fertile ground for creativity. In some ways, the act of drawing in the margins was an act of survival, mental, spiritual, even emotional. Picture it. Hours bent over a desk, your fingers permanently ink-stained, your thoughts floating somewhere between divine inspiration and wondering how long snails sleep. The doodles weren't distractions, they were anchors. Small rebellions. Sighs turned into swirls. And it wasn't just snails. Some manuscripts featured rabbits riding dogs, bishops getting chased by geese, monkeys playing bagpipes, or a hybrid beast with a rooster's body and a man's face sipping wine. The margins were full of nonsense creatures and surreal comedy, but none quite caught on like the knight versus snail motif. Why? Maybe because it was so absurd it became universal. It echoed the quiet frustrations of the scribe, the pomp of knighthood, and the everyday reality of life moving slowly, relentlessly, like a snail. It's also worth noting just how personal manuscript production was. Unlike modern books churned out by machines, each medieval manuscript was an intimate object. Someone raised the calf that provided the vellum. Someone ground the lapis lazuli for the blue ink. Someone trimmed the quills, stirred the glue, and held the candle. It was a symphony of labor, and into that long, repetitive work, the scribe poured little pieces of himself. A joke here, a flourish there, a knight with his sword drawn, facing a garden snail who seems weirdly confident for a mollusk. Meanwhile, outside the scriptorium, the world turned slowly on its hinge. In the towns, markets buzzed with tradesmen hawking salt fish and bitter ale. In castles, noblewomen spun wool while their husbands played politics over mutton. And somewhere out in a field, an actual snail slimed its way across a cabbage leaf, blissfully unaware it had become an icon of manuscript mischief. Back at your desk, you dip your quill again. The parchment drinks up the ink. You carefully outline the little catapult snail's smug grin. There's something therapeutic about this. The scratch of pen, the smell of parchment and beeswax, the soft flicker of candlelight. It's quiet, yes, but not empty. The more you draw, the more you feel connected to scribes across centuries, those nameless hands who added whimsy to sacred pages, who balanced reverence with ridiculousness. They made the serious tolerable. They made the sacred human. Your thoughts wander again. Did anyone ever get in trouble for this? Surely some overzealous abbot eventually noticed that his monastery's finest gospel now featured a jousting snail. Was there ever a crackdown on marginalia? A stern lecture on the dangers of mollusk humor? We'll never know. The records are, well, marginal. But what we do know is that these drawings persisted, not just in one monastery or one region, but across Europe. France, England, Germany, the Low Countries, they all had their snails. Some armored, some naked, all facing knights who looked equal parts brave and bewildered. One theory suggests the snail represented death, slow, creeping, inevitable, a memento mori in a comic shell. Others say it symbolized cowardice, or futility, or maybe it was just funny. Maybe that's all it had to be. You finish your final lines for the day. The knight has now slipped on a banana peel. The snail looks deeply unimpressed. You close the manuscript, stretch your cramped fingers, and let your eyes adjust to the deepening twilight. Another page done. Another strange, small battle inked into history. The sun's dipped low beyond the stained glass windows now, casting long purple shadows across the desk. You exhale, stretching your back with a satisfying crack, then settle in for another stretch of copying. The quiet hum of the scriptorium wraps around you like a woolen blanket. And tonight's companion? Yet another defiant little snail, squaring off against a knight with an axe the size of a dinner plate. Because apparently, size doesn't matter when you're a snail with a mission. You pause for a moment, tapping the edge of your quill against your lip. Just what was the obsession with these armored mollusks? Why not frogs? Or squirrels? Why the slow, slimy symbol of something? Well, to get closer to an answer, you have to step back. Way back. Welcome to the 13th century. The age of crusades, cathedral building, and increasingly, a boom in illuminated manuscripts. Thanks to the rise of Gothic script and urban centers with thriving book trades, more books were being made than ever before. And with more books came more margins. And with more margins came snail drama. It wasn't just in psalters, either. Marginalia snails showed up in bestiaries, books of hours, even legal documents. Picture it, a deadly serious deed of land sale, and off to the side, a little snail jousting a chicken. Charming. So how did this all become so widespread? Well, historians still argue whether it was a case of viral medieval humor, like the world's slowest meme, or a deeper shared allegory. Maybe monks saw the snail as symbolic of a sin to be overcome, like sloth. Maybe knights facing snails were literal metaphors for fighting your inner laziness. Or maybe it was satire, the idea of a knight, a literal symbol of power, honor, and feudal muscle, brought to his knees by garden vermin. And it wasn't just in one region. In fact, if you traveled Europe during this time, pack a cloak and your patience. Travel's not exactly speedy. You'd find snails popping up in manuscript margins from England to Flanders to Italy. One particularly famous manuscript, the Smithfield Decretals, circa 1340, features a remarkable range of snail duels. In one margin, the knight is mid-lunge. In another, he's fleeing. In yet another, the snail has inexplicably grown wings. The consistency is uncanny, like watching a storyboard unfold in slow motion over multiple pages. What's fascinating is how these images feel collaborative, as if over time, each scribe or illuminator took inspiration from the last, building a shared language of absurdity. One gave the snail a helmet, another added a lance. One especially creative soul gave the snail a shield shaped like a potato. It's almost as if medieval Europe had an inside joke, passed along quietly from pen to pen. And honestly, that makes perfect sense. Because when you spend years hand copying scripture or dry legal commentary, your mind needs play. Your soul needs a chuckle. You might not be able to add a punchline in the main text, but the margins? They're your stage. You imagine a monk in York receiving a manuscript from a Parisian scriptorium. He flips through it, admiring the careful lettering, the brilliant gold leaf, and then pauses. There, in the corner, a knight lies flat on his back, a smug snail perched atop his chest like a Roman conqueror. The monk stares. Then, ever so slowly, he smiles. Challenge accepted. The next volume he copies? He adds a dragon snail. This intertextual visual game mirrors our own meme culture in eerie ways. One creator riffs off another, tweaking the absurdity just a notch further. The joke is never spoken aloud, but everyone who sees it understands. The snail becomes not just a character, but a tradition. Of course, some readers were less amused. A 14th century abbot is said to have scrawled in the margins of one manuscript, "Stop adding foolishness, Brother Thomas." To which Brother Thomas may have replied, silently, by drawing a snail with a monocle and a pipe in the next margin. Your quill scrapes gently now as you sketch the latest duel. The knight's sword is broken. The snail is holding a tiny flag. It reads, again. You shake your head, laughing softly to yourself. If anyone were to read this 100 years from now, would they get the joke? Would they understand the longing behind it? The need to leave just a little bit of yourself behind in the pages? Maybe. Or maybe they just wonder, again, why medieval scribes seemed so obsessed with gastropod warfare. Historians still debate whether the snail motif was a passing fad, a deeply rooted allegory, or a coping mechanism. But whatever the answer, its persistence speaks volumes. Because even in an era of plagues, crusades, and looming damnation, people found ways to make each other laugh. Not loudly, not brashly, but softly, with ink and whimsy, in the safe spaces between the lines. And that's a kind of hope, isn't it? You pause again, candlelight flickering low now, and glance over your day's work. Psalms, prayers, and yes, snails. All carefully arranged. All part of the same quiet rebellion. In a world where not much changed, where your days could blur into one long act of obedience, a single silly drawing could feel like lightning. Brief, bright, yours. So you keep going. Because tomorrow, someone will open this book and smile. And maybe, just maybe, they'll draw a snail of their own. The candle is burning lower now, the wax pooling in lazy spirals near your elbow. A distant bell tolls somewhere in the monastery, marking the hour in that soft, echoing way that only stone buildings seem to manage. But you're still focused, hunched slightly, adding the finishing touches to a particularly smug-looking snail who's just vanquished his armored foe. The knight's helmet lies beside him, plume wilting. You can't help but smirk. And while we've spent some time speculating about what snails might mean, you start to wonder something else entirely. Where did these illustrations even come from? Who decided that a book full of sacred prayers or moral codes needed a battle between an arthropod and a fully armored man in its margins? Let's talk about the real artists behind these peculiar scenes, the illuminators. Not the scribes, mind you. They were the ones who copied the text with excruciating care. But illuminators? They were the rock stars of the medieval manuscript world. With their tiny brushes, egg-based paints, and gold leaf so thin it practically vanished at a whisper, they turned each book into a riot of color and whimsy. And sometimes they got bored, really bored. Because illuminating a book wasn't just about painting Jesus for the 100th time or re-inking a page border with perfectly symmetrical ivy vines. No, sometimes it meant 16-hour days bent over parchment, working by candlelight, fingers cramping, while a stern monk loomed nearby with opinions about your palette choices. And in those cramped studios or cloisters, creativity began to seep out sideways, literally into the margins. One popular theory is that these drawings were a kind of visual code, a wink from one illuminator to another. You can picture it now, a young apprentice slipping in a doodle of a knight flailing at a snail, just to see if anyone noticed. When no one did, or if the reaction was amused rather than angry, it became a tradition. In some workshops, these playful additions may have even been encouraged. Marginalia wasn't always strictly unauthorized. Wealthy patrons, commissioning books of hours for personal devotion, might request some amusements alongside the religious content. You could imagine a baroness whispering, and perhaps a funny rabbit, fighting a knight. My cousin would laugh. And laugh they did, because these images didn't stay confined to one genre or one region. As manuscript culture flourished, especially in France and England, so too did the snails. You start to see patterns. In northern France, the snails often look more naturalistic, with proper spiraled shells and tiny antennae. In England, they sometimes have oddly expressive faces, grins, scowls, even beady little eyes that seem to know exactly what they're doing. In Italy, snails appear slightly less often, but when they do, they're bolder, like one magnificent example where a snail rides a horse. Yes, a horse. Historians still argue whether these regional styles had deeper meaning. Were the differences cultural? Political? Was the knight and snail motif a parody of specific military groups? Or was it just another reminder that even jokes evolve across borders? Either way, the trend wasn't isolated. In fact, these scenes were just one part of a broader marginalia explosion. Alongside your snails, you'd often find animals playing instruments, people balancing teapots on their heads, dogs in armor, naked men hiding in flowers, and monkeys doing, frankly baffling things with wine jugs. The medieval mind, it turns out, was delightfully weird. But there's one thing the snail consistently brings to the table: contrast. He's small, he's slow, he's squishy, and yet here he is, holding his ground against shining metal, polished shields, and flowing capes. The snail always seems to win, or at least to hold his own. And in an age where feudal hierarchy defined every aspect of life, that had to feel deliciously subversive, you can almost hear the whisper in the back of the scriptorium. Who's the real hero? The man with a sword, or the one with a shell? The candle flickers again, the light catching on the damp shimmer of the snail's painted trail. It's a tiny touch, a detail only another illuminator might notice. But it matters, because these books weren't just data. They were alive. They breathed through pigment and imagination. And while the main text might be scripture or law or moral tales, the margins were where humanity slipped in, where tired artists let themselves laugh, where resistance, however absurd, curled its shell and stood its ground. And in this way, the knight versus snail motif becomes a kind of paradox, serious play, ridiculous courage, faith through farce. You set down your quill now, hands sore, eyes watering slightly. But as you lean back, you feel oddly satisfied. This page has weight, humor, mystery. Somewhere, someday, someone will turn this page and pause, and wonder, why is there a knight charging at a snail? And the answer won't be printed in any index. It's in the moment, in the impulse, in the invisible bond across time between two people who simply needed to grin. You think of your fellow illuminators scattered across Europe, some long gone, some still at work in rooms not so different from yours. And you hope they added snails today too, just to keep the tradition alive. The days blend together in the scriptorium, quiet footsteps, the whisper of turning pages, the steady scrape of quills against parchment. But today is different. Today, your fingers itch with mischief. You've decided your next snail will wear a tiny crown. And not just any crown, a gleaming, jewel-encrusted one, perched slightly askew like it's been stolen from a slumbering king. The knight beside him, meanwhile, is noticeably unimpressed, maybe even terrified. Because here's a strange but delightful detail. In many of these snail knight duels, the knight looks scared. Really scared. Sometimes he's recoiling. Other times, he's already halfway turned around, running for his life. And occasionally, this is where things get especially cheeky. The knight is flat on his back, lance snapped, as the snail oozes triumphantly over his armor. It flips everything on its head. And it's worth pausing for a moment to consider just how wild that would have seemed to a medieval viewer. Remember, these were societies obsessed with hierarchy. Nobles above peasants, men above women, humans above animals, and definitely knights above snails. So when a humble garden mollusk bests a fully armored warrior, it's not just funny, it's subversive. Gentle, glacial speed satire. Historians still argue whether these terrified knights were meant to mock the very concept of chivalry. Was this a subtle jab at failed crusades? A snide comment on the futility of warfare? Or perhaps a way for the artist to cope with the suffocating reverence surrounding noble knighthood? Because, if we're being honest, medieval knights weren't exactly cartoon heroes. They were often brutal, expensive, politically messy. Many didn't even fight in the grand tournaments or noble duels we associate them with today. Instead, they spent their time collecting taxes, enforcing feudal duties, or, let's be honest, bullying peasants. The idea that a slow-moving garden pest could bring one of them down? That had to feel like delicious revenge for anyone stuck at the bottom of the social ladder. But not all interpretations are so rebellious. In some readings, the snail becomes a spiritual symbol. The knight isn't scared of the snail itself, but what it represents: death. The slow, creeping, inescapable passage of time. A subtle memento mori hidden in the margins of an otherwise holy book. You stare at your newest doodle, the crowned snail sitting proudly atop a defeated knight's breastplate, and try to decide which version you like better. Is this comedy or tragedy? Probably both. Because in the Middle Ages, those lines blurred often. People laughed at what scared them. They made jokes about devils, drew demons with chicken legs and sausage noses. They even carved absurd monsters into the corners of churches, grotesques with bug eyes and flapping tongues. It was a way of coping, of controlling fear by giving it a funny face. And maybe your little snail does the same. It's not the only creature to show up uninvited in a manuscript. Marginalia overflows with unexpected animals. Hedgehogs stealing grapes, birds jousting with frogs, foxes preaching to geese. And don't even get started on the monkeys. There are so many monkeys. Sometimes dressed as doctors, sometimes cooking porridge, sometimes performing sacraments in mockery of human priests. You can almost hear the illuminators chuckling as they worked, pushing boundaries, daring someone to notice. But for all the absurdity, these illustrations weren't random. They formed a secret dialogue between the artist and the reader, a chance to slip a sly commentary into otherwise solemn spaces. Take the knight again. The image of a lone warrior, bravely charging toward a foe, is classic. But when that foe is a snail, everything changes. It becomes a story about futility, or pride, or misplaced valor. The kind of lesson that's easier to digest when it's tucked beside a psalm. You shade the edge of the knight's shield now, careful to add a faint crack down the middle. It's subtle, but it tells a story. He's fought before, maybe even lost before. And still, he rides again. Maybe that's the point. Not mockery, not satire, but empathy. What if the snail isn't an enemy at all? What if it's a mirror? A reminder that even the smallest battles matter. That courage can come in unexpected forms. That the world is full of slow, stubborn things that somehow persist, no matter how absurd the odds. You glance over your shoulder. No one's watching. You add a tiny smile to the snail's face. Just a hint. Enough to suggest it knows something you don't. The candle's flame dances slightly as someone passes by behind you. Another illuminator, arms full of vellum. They catch a glimpse of your margin and snort softly, shaking their head. But they don't tell you to erase it. Because they get it. They've drawn their own battles. Their own beasts and jokes and dreams. Maybe their snails fly. Maybe their knights carry umbrellas. Maybe their margins are filled with boats made of bread and dragons in nightgowns. Every artist has their own language. And here, in this sleepy corner of history, the snail has become yours. You pause, stretch your fingers, and prepare the next sheet. There's another scene forming in your mind already. A tournament, perhaps, with a snail as the guest of honor. Or maybe, just maybe, this time the knight wins. But probably not. The ink settles slowly on the page as you finish your latest doodle, letting it dry in the candlelight. The snail's eyes, those strange little stalks, seem to meet yours. There's mischief in them, a certain smugness, as if it knows this image will last far longer than any of your neatly lettered prayers. You sigh. Time to get back to work. Or not, because your mind is drifting now, not forward, but backward. You think about the very beginnings of this snail obsession. Where did it start? Who was the first brave soul to draw a knight in full regalia dueling a glorified garden slug? The answer, frustratingly, is that no one really knows. Historians still argue whether the motif originated as early as the late 13th century in French psalters or slightly later in English books of hours. The truth is, the marginalia movement wasn't centralized. It blossomed organically across Europe, like a quiet rebellion that didn't need a leader. And once the snail appeared, it spread like ivy across the vellum of Christendom. But here's the kicker: there is no known text that explains it. No sermon, no marginal note, no monk's diary entry saying, "Today, I drew a snail trouncing a knight to make Brother Gerard laugh." It's all speculation, gentle, whispering speculation. And somehow, that makes it even more fascinating. One theory points to the notion of cowardice. In this interpretation, the snail symbolizes the coward, slowly creeping toward confrontation, armored yet hesitant. The knight, then, becomes the foil, a figure of glory reduced to futility by such a laughable opponent. A joke about fear, about men too proud to face what scares them, whether it's battle or introspection. But others disagree. They say the snail wasn't cowardly, it was tenacious. Hard to kill, oddly noble in its persistence. Some cultures even viewed snails as sacred symbols of resurrection and patience, thanks to their ability to vanish into their shells and reemerge unharmed. You can picture the medieval mind chewing on that contradiction. A soft, slimy thing that wears armor, survives winters, and carries its house wherever it goes? It's not hard to imagine that such a creature would spark admiration, confusion, and humor all at once. And speaking of contradictions, let's not forget that these illustrations often appeared in religious texts. That's right. Between Psalms of David and Lamentations of Jeremiah, there's a knight dueling a snail. Somewhere beside a passage on divine grace, you might find a monkey baking bread. Even the Gospels weren't safe. You might assume this was considered blasphemous. Surely, someone raised a fuss? But surprisingly, it seems medieval readers took it in stride. In fact, they may have found the playfulness oddly appropriate. See, to a medieval Christian, the world wasn't divided into sacred and silly the way we often assume. Everything, every ant, every tree, every human folly, reflected the divine in some convoluted way. The margins weren't separate from the text. They were part of the conversation. Even now, as you draw, you feel it. That strange sense of spiritual play. You're copying a sacred litany, yes, but also creating something new. Something deeply human. A private joke between you and, well, whoever finds this book centuries from now. Because you're not alone, not really. The scriptorium is full of quiet motion. A page turns here, a throat clears there. Someone stifles a yawn. And above it all, the soft scratching of quills, dozens of them, like rain falling in a library. You wonder if Brother Matthias, sitting 2 seats over, has added his own snail today. He's fond of exaggerating them, gives them tusks, little helmets, once even a saddle. One time, he drew a snail carrying a saint on its back. You rolled your eyes at that one. But secretly, you loved it. These weren't just distractions. They were connections. The kind of silent camaraderie born of shared boredom and sore wrists. You weren't just copying texts. You were part of a quiet, centuries-long tradition of artists sneaking their voices into the margins of history. Sometimes literally. Here's a funny thing. Some manuscripts include little messages in their margins. Unrelated to the drawings. Complaints, jokes, even weather updates. You might read, "I am very cold." Or, "This parchment is hairy." Or everyone's favorite, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." It's the medieval equivalent of leaving a sticky note on your coworker's desk. These were humans, after all. Fallible, sleepy, snack-hungry humans. And the snails? Well, they may have been the most honest expression of that humanity. Absurd, persistent, inexplicably joyful. You glance at your nearly finished page. The text is clean. Illuminated letters curl like ivy. And in the corner, half hidden beneath a gilded vine, the duel continues. This time, the snail has a tiny jousting lance. The knight leans forward, eyes wide, as if realizing, far too late, that this isn't a dream. This is really happening, and he's probably going to lose. You chuckle softly to yourself. Somewhere deep down, you know that long after the names are forgotten, after the abbey crumbles, the vellum yellows, and the world changes a dozen times over, someone might still find this page, run their fingers over the faded ink, smile, and wonder what it all meant. You lean back for a moment, rubbing your ink-stained fingers. The air in the scriptorium is thick with wax, wool, and human stillness. And yet, On your little square of vellum, there's a battle raging, an epic confrontation between a snail and a knight that no one asked for, yet everyone seems to expect. And if you're wondering how this became a thing, how such an absurd idea spread from one cloistered mind to another, you're not alone. Even now, historians squint at these snails and scratch their heads, not just because they're bafflingly common, but because they're so weirdly consistent across time and geography. From the manuscripts of Flanders to the Book of Hours in northern Italy, even as far as German psalters, the knight versus snail motif appears again and again. Always a lone warrior, usually noble-looking, always facing off against a giant or comically large snail. And this wasn't a medieval meme passed via some underground monk newsletter. There were no carrier pigeons bringing the snail of the week to every monastery in Europe. No, this spread by hand, by eyes, by shared silence, maybe a whispered chuckle behind the back of a stern abbot. Scholars have proposed several theories, and each one is just plausible enough to be almost true. Some link the snail to the Lombards, a group of Germanic people considered the enemies of the Franks. Apparently, Lombards were portrayed as cowardly, and the snail was a visual shorthand, a mocking jab in ink. But there's little evidence the common monk would have had strong feelings about the Lombards by the time snail-dueling knights were in vogue. Then there's the memento mori theory. In this reading, the snail represents death. Slow, unstoppable, creeping ever closer no matter how armed or righteous you are. Which, sure, is poetic, even a bit chilling. The image of a knight, proud and resolute, brought low not by sword or sin, but by the world's tiniest battering ram. But that feels a little too tidy, doesn't it? Especially when some of these snails are clearly drunk, or dancing, or being chased by the knight. Sometimes they even have legs. Yes, legs. Not like normal snail legs, but strange stick-figure limbs emerging from their coiled bodies. One even appears to be wearing slippers. Another carries a flag. Some are shown mid-duel, others mid-swim. And one particular gem from a 14th century psalter in Oxford features a snail riding a dog. Or maybe the dog is riding the snail. It's hard to tell. Either way, the knight is running the other way. It's not just snails, of course. The medieval margins were wild. Frogs with swords, hybrid beasts with human heads, monkeys playing bagpipes, cats playing organs, nuns plucking fruit from trees that have human faces. You could spend hours in those margins and never make it back to the main text. And maybe that was the point. Maybe, amid all the rigid routine and severe theology, the margins became the playground. A breathing space. Imagine being a monk tasked with copying the Lamentations of Jeremiah for the third time in your life. Every letter must be perfect. The rubric must be aligned. There is no room for error, no celebration of individuality. Until the margin. There, you are free. Not entirely. Of course, your abbey has rules. But what harm is there in a little snail? It's not blasphemous. It's not obscene. It's just silly. And in that silliness, something miraculous happens. Joy. Think about that. In an age where joy was scarce and punishment was swift, the act of doodling a snail became an act of quiet rebellion. A wink across the centuries. A reminder that the people who lived before you weren't so different after all. They got bored. They got tired. They doodled when no one was looking. And those doodles have outlived kings. There's also the sheer practicality of it all. Margins weren't just decorative. They were buffers, spaces for commentary, errata, and repairs. But they were also where the eye could rest. Manuscripts could be dense, both in content and in visual clutter. The margins gave relief. In the same way, your snail is a pressure valve. A brief distraction for your eyes, your wrist, your mind. A joke that lands even after 800 years, even in the flickering light of a tired monk's chamber. Now, as your hand returns to the page, you glance at your neighbor's work. Brother Arnold is sketching what appears to be a lion wearing a bishop's mitre. He notices your glance and smirks without lifting his head. You've never spoken about your marginalia. You never need to. You're part of a tradition now, one that no pope or plague could erase. And that's oddly comforting. Because here's the thing. History isn't just the rise and fall of empires. It's not only treaties and battles and royal genealogies. Sometimes, history is a snail and a doodle that outlasts dynasties. A quiet, ridiculous rebellion drawn in oak gall ink at the edge of a prayer. And tonight, as your candle gutters low and your page dries gently, you're reminded once more that the strangest things can be the most enduring, especially if they have a shell. Your candle has burned down to a nub, but you don't mind. The moonlight spills gently through the small high window, and your hand rests against a vellum sheet that crinkles just slightly at the edge. You've finished your own work for the night, but your thoughts linger, not on scripture or saints, but on something much slower and slimier. The snail, of course. And now, as you stretch your legs and meander to the fire pit, where a few embers still glow, you wonder, why knights? Why do these brave, armored figures, supposed symbols of valor and honor, so often appear in absurd, humiliating combat against mollusks? You settle in, mind drifting, eyes half-lidded, and begin retracing the place of knights in the medieval imagination. You see, the knight wasn't just a man in armor. He was an idea, a symbol, a layered costume of virtue and violence, chivalry and conquest. To be a knight was to inhabit a role that was just as much performance as it was practicality. And by the 13th and 14th centuries, this ideal was already, well, getting a little old, a little overplayed. Chivalric tales, those grand stories of justs and quests and damsels rescued from towers, were everywhere. But so were real knights, who were sometimes less noble and more brutish than their songs suggested. And the monks? They saw it all. To the cloistered scribe, the knight might have seemed like an arrogant outsider. Loud, violent, flashy, a walking contradiction to the monastic ideals of humility and silence. And so, the best way to deflate a symbol is with absurdity. What better opponent than a snail? Imagine it. Here is Sir Geoffrey of Loudshire, hero of 10 crusades, scourge of bandits, locked in mortal combat with a garden pest. He raises his shining blade. The snail glistens threateningly. A duel for the ages. You can't help but smile. Humor has always been a sneaky, subversive tool. It doesn't yell, it nudges. It sits in the back pew and raises one eyebrow. And in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, humor took many forms. But one of its sharpest arrows was mockery. Some scholars believe these snail versus knight illustrations were gentle jabs at the overly proud, at those who took themselves too seriously, the kind of nobles who strutted rather than walked, the kind of clerics who sermonized too grandly. Others argue that they were commentaries on futility. The knight, a figure of human might and invention, is rendered helpless against a creature that leaves sparkly slime trails and eats lettuce. A medieval David and Goliath, but with more mucus. And then there's the theory of moral allegory. Snails, slow and low to the ground, were sometimes seen as symbols of laziness, cowardice, or sin. Pair them with a knight, ideally brave, swift, and righteous, and you've got a visual sermon in miniature. A reminder that even the virtuous must battle the creeping evils of the flesh, even if those evils look a bit silly. But again, this theory runs into a problem. Some of the snails are winning. Yes, you heard that right. Some of the manuscripts show the knight literally fleeing. Others show the snail with the upper hand, or upper antennae, as it were. The traditional moral reading starts to unravel when the snail becomes the aggressor. So maybe, and here's a controversial idea, the snail is not a symbol. Maybe it's just a snail. And maybe the monks were just having fun. Because for all their piety, for all the solemn chants and endless copying, medieval scribes were still people. Bored people, tired people, people who liked jokes, even if they couldn't write them in the actual text. Historians still argue whether the marginalia was officially tolerated or merely overlooked. Some abbeys were more lenient. Others strictly forbade idle drawings. But whether sanctioned or sneaked in, the margins became a place where reality loosened its grip just a little. It's easy to imagine two monks at adjacent desks, daring each other in whispers. I bet you won't draw another snail joust. Oh yeah? Watch me give this one a lute. And suddenly, the snail has an instrument. Maybe it's serenading the night. Maybe it's just adding ambience to the battlefield. Who's to say? Even today, artists know that absurdity often holds truth. That laughter can disarm, destabilize, and sometimes illuminate in ways serious work cannot. So while we may never know exactly what each snail duel meant to its creator, we can appreciate the ripple it created, through time, through silence, through ink. And maybe, in your own life, there's something that feels big and armored and unassailable. A towering pressure, a looming fear, something that clanks and stomps in your direction. Maybe it's worth imagining a snail in its path, just for a moment. Because absurdity is a kind of shield, too. And here in the warm flicker of medieval candlelight, as the snail raises its tiny sword and the knight hesitates, you remember, there's strength in laughter, and there's legacy in whimsy. The room is quiet now, just the soft shuffling of parchment as you return to your desk, where the illumination glows softly against the walls. You dip your quill again, but not to copy scripture this time. No, you're sketching something in the corner of the page, something with a shell. Another snail. And this one? It's wearing a helmet. You've come to accept them, haven't you? These little shelled soldiers scuttling across the margins. They've grown on you, quite literally, if your manuscript collection is anything to go by. But if knights were being mocked, if symbolism was slippery, then what about the audience? Who was reading these texts? And what did they make of all this snail business? Let's zoom out a bit. Most illuminated manuscripts weren't meant for the masses. These weren't bedtime storybooks lying on every peasant's haystack pillow. They were luxury items, often commissioned by nobility, clergy, or wealthy patrons who wanted a little divine insurance alongside their gold leaf borders. And that means the snails weren't just inside jokes for scribes. They were visible, present, displayed, which raises the question, why did no one object? Why didn't the patrons say, "Excuse me, Brother Aldred, why is Sir Lambeth du Ferelm being defeated by what appears to be a garden pest?" One answer? Maybe they liked it. It's easy to assume that people in the Middle Ages were rigid, somber, and grim, perpetually concerned with sin and plague. But evidence suggests that medieval humor was alive, well, and often surprisingly bawdy or absurd. From the plays of Chaucer to the fabliaux of France, there was a definite appetite for the ridiculous. A nobleman might chuckle at a snail knight just as much as you do now. And perhaps it was even more meaningful when the absurd appeared in religious manuscripts. There's a strange comfort in contradiction in placing the sacred beside the silly. It says, even in our highest pursuits, we're still human. So yes, even among gold leaf and carefully inked saints, a snail might crawl through. In fact, let's look at one particularly fascinating example, the Smithfield Decretals. This lavish 14th century manuscript, a copy of canon law, contains hundreds of marginal drawings, and yes, snails abound. In one folio, a knight in full armor lunges dramatically at a snail that simply stares back at him. In another, a monkey with a crown watches the combat unfold from a nearby vine. It's like Monty Python by candlelight. What's even more amusing is that the text on that same page might be detailing serious ecclesiastical rulings, how to resolve disputes over tithes or whether a bishop's appointment is valid. And all the while, in the margin, chaos reigns. Now imagine being a reader, perhaps a bored monk in a quieter moment, flipping through these heavy pages for some mental reprieve. You come across another snail battle. You smile. Maybe you nudge your neighbor and point. Again? That's the third one this week. You laugh. You rest. You move on. And that's another secret of the snail. They were little oases. Tiny amusements in otherwise heavy, repetitive work. For scribes, they were joy. For readers, they were reminders that life is strange, and that even the weightiest tomes need breathing room. Historians still argue whether these margins were meant for the soul or the senses. Some insist they were meditative tools, visual riddles designed to slow the reader down, to make them notice. Others argue they were filler, decoration, glorified doodles. But in both cases, the effect was the same, a moment of pause. And as you stretch again and look at your own half-finished manuscript, you start to see the value in that, in allowing the ridiculous to break through the ritual. Of course, not everyone was amused. By the late Middle Ages, certain church reformers began to criticize excessive decoration. They worried that the margins were distracting from the divine, that too much levity led to lax discipline. Some manuscripts from the 15th century show a steep decline in absurd marginalia. But the damage or the joy was already done. The snails had made their mark, and some of them traveled far. There are reports of snail nights in Italian prayer books, in German devotional texts, even in early printed works where illustrations had to be carved painstakingly into wood blocks. The meme, you might say, had gone viral. It's humbling, isn't it? To think that long before Reddit or Instagram, long before TikTok trends and meme culture, there were monks drawing snails in the corners of sacred books. Not because they had to, because it made them smile. And that smile, passed from artist to artist, reader to reader, century to century, has reached you now. So maybe the question isn't why the snails fought knights. Maybe it's why not. Why shouldn't there be a little nonsense tucked inside our most serious endeavors? Why shouldn't a knight be startled by something small and slow and silly? Why shouldn't we allow ourselves to laugh, even in the margins? The fire crackles softly behind you. Your ink dries. The snail waits, poised with its tiny lance. And somewhere in the dim quiet of the scriptorium, another monk grins and draws. You wake from a brief nap at your desk, face lightly pressed into the edge of your latest parchment, the faint scent of ink still lingering in your nostrils. Outside, the wind nudges the monastery shutters, and inside, the silence hums like an old lullaby. Your eyes adjust again to the dancing glow of the candle. And as you look closer at the margins of your work, you spot it. Another familiar figure emerging from a tangle of vines and gold leaf. Another snail. This one's wielding a spatula? You blink. No, not a spatula, a very flat lance. But for a second, it could have gone either way. And it's not alone. In this section of the manuscript, the margins teem with activity. Rabbits jousting, monkeys in clerical robes, a man holding a fish the size of a bench. But the snail? Yes, the snail still holds center stage. This page, like many others, hails from a fascinating intersection of fantasy and folklore, where medieval beliefs about the natural world shaped what artists doodled and detailed. And few animals straddled that line between mundane and magical quite like the snail. You might not think of the humble snail as a creature of legend, but in medieval bestiaries, those grand catalogues of beasts both real and imaginary, the lines between nature and nonsense blurred beautifully. Unicorns? Sure. Basilisks? Absolutely. But also, snails. According to some medieval texts, snails were described with a degree of mystery. Their spiral shells were considered cosmic symbols. Their slime trails, proof of alchemical qualities, and their ability to vanish into their shells, clearly a magical defense. Some monks saw the snail as a stand-in for resurrection, death into shell, rebirth into slime. Others, more practically, used snails as medicine. Believe it or not, crushed snails were a common ingredient in medieval remedies for sore throats, ulcers, and even toothaches. No, seriously, next time you gripe about medieval dentistry, just remember someone once said, "Have you tried snail paste?" Yet for all these varied associations, one thread keeps winding through the centuries: slowness. The snail's pace became symbolic of more than just physical speed. It represented humility, patience, even laziness in certain sermons. Picture a preacher pointing to a margin and scolding, "Be not like the snail, O brothers, sluggish in your prayers." And yet, artists kept drawing them, over and over. Why? Maybe because the snail was endlessly adaptable. One moment, it's a divine metaphor. The next, it's comic relief. Just like us, it could be both ridiculous and revered. Take, for example, the Luttrell Psalter again. Yes, we visited it before, but it keeps giving. In its margins, you'll find not only snails fighting knights, but also snails confronting lions, archers, and even other snails. It's like an entire mollusk military campaign waging quietly along the edge of a psalm. And here's a twist. In some illustrations, the knight loses. Yes, he falls, tumbles backward, defeated by a creature you could probably outpace while wearing socks on ice. That inversion, of great strength felled by soft absurdity, tickled the medieval sense of irony. It was a topsy-turvy reminder that nothing is quite what it seems. And speaking of topsy-turvy, let's talk about another medieval tradition that embraced the absurd, the Feast of Fools. During this raucous holiday, lower clergy would parody higher officials, wear masks, perform comedic rituals, and generally invert the expected order. Sacred chants gave way to rude songs. Bishops' robes were worn by stable boys. Laughter echoed in the cathedral. The Feast of Fools was chaotic, humorous, and at times scandalous, but deeply human. And guess what often crept into the artwork produced around it? You guessed it, snails. Tiny reminders that even in sacred parody, some themes crawl on. Historians still debate whether the snail was officially tied to the Feast of Fools or simply reflected the same spirit, a shared celebration of the weird, the inverted, the wonderfully useless. But there's no denying that by the late Middle Ages, the armored snail had become a recognizable visual joke, a visual trope, one that transcended language. You didn't need to read Latin to laugh at a knight being upstaged by escargot and chainmail. And for modern viewers like you, tucked in bed and watching this sleepy tale unfold, the joke still lands. It's still funny. Which brings us to another idea, memes. Not just modern, digital memes, but cultural ones, repeating ideas, symbols, and jokes that replicate across time and space. Scholars sometimes call this the meme of the knight defeating snail. And it makes you wonder, was the very first artist who drew it trying to make a point? Was it a protest? A pun? A joke told across generations of scribes? Or just a bit of doodling after a long afternoon of copying psalms? It could be any of those. It could be all of them. And isn't that the magic? Just like in modern meme culture, the medieval snail knight trope was endlessly remixable. One artist might show the snail winning. Another might give it wings. Another might draw it holding a tiny, worried flag. Whatever the version, the message crept in softly, like the creature itself. Absurdity is inevitable. Sometimes, life is slow, weird, and oddly wonderful. And maybe, just maybe, your own story is scrawled in the margins, too. The ink dries slowly. You sit back, fingers slightly numb from hours of work, eyes tracing the snail and the night once again. There's a strange calm in the repetition, like the margins are whispering their own sleepy stories. But your curiosity, however softened by the candlelight, isn't quite satisfied yet. Because here's a quiet mystery. Who decided this was allowed? Who said, sure, you can illustrate the Holy Scriptures and also draw a rabbit playing the lute next to a naked man juggling frogs? More to the point, why didn't anyone stop it? To answer that, we need to consider the surprisingly loose rules of medieval manuscript production. See, while the main body of a religious text had to follow strict orthodoxy, the marginalia, the little doodles and illustrations in the outer edges, were often left up to the whims of the scribe or the illuminator. Sometimes, they were just killing time. Other times, they were expressing private jokes, making veiled commentary on church politics, or just experimenting with form and beauty. The margins became creative playgrounds. Quiet, dusty spaces for personality. And let's not forget, not all manuscripts were made for solemn monks. Wealthy nobles commissioned books too, books of hours, romances, hunting manuals. These clients often wanted some flair, something fun. So a snail in armor might have been exactly the kind of mischief a noble patron chuckled over at the dinner table. Look at this one, he'd say, flipping to a page and calling over his guests. The brave Sir Geoffrey, defeated by a garden pest. Laughter in Latin. Of course, not everyone approved. Some ecclesiastical authorities scorned the more outlandish marginalia. There were occasional rebukes. These scribes are wasting time, defiling sacred work, etc. But the truth? There wasn't a centralized visual standard. No uniform ban. So unless someone powerful specifically complained, the snails marched on. And march they did. Let's zoom in on a manuscript from 14th century France. It's known as the Smithfield Decretals, and it's utterly drenched in marginal mischief. Alongside solemn legal texts about canon law and papal authority, you find full-color illustrations of bears playing organs, men dressed as birds, and, you guessed it, snails in heated battle. What's more, the snail appears alongside other absurd duels, monkeys fighting dogs, bishops dueling geese. It seems the artists were creating a world where the absurd mirrored the real, perhaps even critiqued it. Because here's the delicious irony. While the center of the page deals with divine law and proper conduct, the margins erupt in chaos and parody. It's almost like the medieval version of scrolling through Twitter during a work meeting. The juxtaposition says something timeless. Life is rarely just one thing. Even in sacred texts, absurdity lives side by side with solemnity. And the world, even the quiet medieval one, is never not weird. You start to notice patterns. The snail is often pitted against a knight, yes, but sometimes the knight's face looks suspiciously similar to certain known rulers or figures of the time. Could this be satire? Historians still argue whether some of these snails were meant to mock specific people, kings, corrupt clergy, or just the concept of chivalry itself. If so, it would make the armored snail one of the earliest forms of editorial cartooning. But even without names, the metaphor persists. Snails versus knights. Soft versus armored. Slow versus aggressive. The underdog, or undergastropod, versus the establishment. And let's not ignore the visual pun. The snail carries its home with it. A mobile fortress. A silly little tank. The knight, meanwhile, wears a shell on his body. Perhaps they're not so different after all. Perhaps this is a battle of mirrors. Or perhaps, stay with me, it's a joke about writing itself. Think about it. The scribe, laboring slowly, endlessly, day after day, is the snail. The manuscript is the battlefield. And the knight, with all his flourish and urgency, represents deadlines, responsibility, authority. You, dear scribe, doodle your defiance in the margins. And in this quiet act of rebellion, you leave behind a joke that survives for 700 years. That's immortality via whimsy. In some ways, you're not unlike the graffiti artist of Pompeii, scratching rude phrases into stone, or the cartoonist of the 18th century caricaturing royalty in woodcut prints, or even modern meme makers photoshopping presidents onto capybaras. It's all the same impulse, same giggle in the dark. And though many manuscripts have faded with time, some snails endure. One particular favorite among historians lives in the Gorlist and Psalter, an early 14th century English manuscript. Here, the snail charges forward valiantly while a knight, mid-tumble, falls backward in comedic surprise. The composition is so exaggerated it might as well be storyboarded. Which leads us to an intriguing theory. Perhaps the artists were experimenting with visual storytelling. Little comic strips, just for the fun of it. In a world with no printing press, no movies, no TikTok, this was their version of a short film in the corners of a prayer book. Panel 1, the knight prepares. Panel 2, the snail lunges. Panel 3, a surprised fall. Fade to black, amen. You chuckle. Maybe it's the late hour, but the idea of ancient comic strips and psalters is unexpectedly charming. And suddenly, you feel it again, the quiet joy of rediscovering something forgotten, of seeing how humor, resistance, and creativity sneak in through the cracks. Not loudly, not with trumpets, but softly, like a snail, 1 inch at a time. You don't remember falling asleep, not really, but when you blink back into the candlelit scriptoria of your mind, the snail is still there. Still charging, still absurd, still oddly brave. And the parchment beneath your fingertips feels warm from the lamp's glow and the gentle weight of history. But what happened to all these manuscripts? Where did they go? Who saved them? Who threw them away? Let's talk about survival, the fragile thread by which all this snail nonsense dangles before our sleepy eyes. You might imagine that something as carefully handcrafted as an illuminated manuscript would be cherished forever. But no, most were treated like books are often treated, loved, used, worn, forgotten, and many repurposed. That's right. Entire manuscripts, illustrated, calligraphed, gilded, were chopped up, recycled into bindings for newer books, ripped apart to line boxes, used as insulation for roofs. Literal insulation. Imagine some monk, centuries ago, painstakingly drawing a jousting snail with a squirrel orchestra in the margins, only for it to end up stuffed inside a boot heel or glued under a wine label. And yet, paradoxically, it's often thanks to this abuse that some fragments survived. You see, once vellum pages were sewn into a book binding or pasted onto the inner spine of a printed volume, they were protected, hidden away, like seeds in a time capsule. Historians still argue whether we've only scratched the surface, whether libraries, archives, and private collectors still unknowingly harbor entire undiscovered galleries of marginal madness, tucked into the bones of early books. And so, when 19th and 20th century scholars began peeling apart old bindings and stumbling on pages full of wrestling rabbits, pipe-smoking monkeys, and, yes, snail duels. They were understandably delighted. Some even changed careers. "I came for theology," one historian quipped, and stayed for the snails. Modern technology has given this quirky heritage new life. High-resolution scans and digitization projects from institutions like the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France have made these images freely viewable online. You can now scroll through the Lattrell Psalter, the Macclesfield Alphabet Book, or the Book of Hours of Jean d'Evreux, zooming in on every tiny joke left by a bored scribe in the 1300s. It's a strange kind of immortality. And more importantly, it's a loop. Because those scribes who filled the margins with snails and serpents and surprised bishops likely never imagined they'd have an audience beyond their monastery walls. They were just doodling, smirking, stretching their wrists. And yet here you are, centuries later, lying on your side in bed, headphones on, letting those doodles walk you into sleep. But before you drift too far, let's reflect on the people behind the parchment. Not the snails, the scribes. They worked in cramped conditions, often in silence, often copying the same text hundreds of times over. They measured each letter's height with a line ruled faintly in lead. They filled their pens with oak gall ink that could eat through the page if mixed wrong. They wore rough robes and wrote by candlelight, and if their hand slipped, a whole page might be ruined. And yet, they found time to joke. One German manuscript contains a little note scribbled in Latin down near the bottom of a particularly long page. It reads simply, "Oh, my hand," followed by a sad little face. Another, more poetic, ends a long passage with, "Thank God, it is done. For now I shall go drink and warm my fingers." And you can feel it, can't you? The humanity. We talk about scribes as monks or craftsmen, but really, they were just people. People who worked long hours, who got cold, who liked jokes, who had a strange affection for snails. They weren't creating for the ages. They were just getting through the day. And somewhere in the act of drawing a helmeted snail stabbing a confused knight, they left behind a time capsule of joy. Something that outlasted the Black Death, the Reformation, the printing press. Something that made it to you. And here's another fun twist. This medieval silliness? It inspired modern art. Salvador Dali, king of dream logic and bendy clocks, cited marginalia as one of his early influences. The blend of reverence and absurdity, of formal composition and ridiculous content, he saw it as a key to unlocking subconscious imagery. More recently, children's books, comic strips, even video games have echoed this whimsical clash of the noble and the nonsensical. Think of Monty Python. Think of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. Think of a squirrel in chainmail riding a duck into battle on the title screen of your favorite indie game. Whether consciously or not, they're carrying forward the torch of medieval weirdness. Even the snails. In fact, there's an online community of artists and historians today who call themselves Team Snail. They paint modern miniatures of night snails. They design stickers, enamel pins, whole Etsy stores based around the theme. You could wear a lapel pin tomorrow with a snail jousting a bishop and nod silently at anyone who recognizes it. It's a secret handshake through time. And maybe, just maybe, that's what those medieval scribes were really after. Not laughter, not protest, not meaning, just connection. One slow, spiraling line at a time. You stretch out in the quiet, the weight of centuries settling into your mattress like a heavy woolen cloak. We're nearing the end now, but there's one more layer left to peel, one more parchment corner to turn. Let's talk about audiences, about who these manuscripts were for, and who actually ended up enjoying them. Because let's be honest, those illuminated margins? They weren't exactly meant for public consumption. Most manuscripts were commissioned by nobles, clergy, or the wealthy elite. Picture a French duchess flipping delicately through her personalized Book of Hours, pausing on a golden halo or perhaps an elaborately feathered peacock. And right there, in the bottom margin, a bear playing the bagpipes. That's a creative risk. But here's the thing, sometimes those patrons liked it. They expected beauty, sure, but also amusement. Some even requested playful elements to test the artist's skill or to lighten long hours of devotion. There are records of medieval lords giving direction like, "I want this next prayer book to be very devout, but also, maybe add a monkey dressed as a doctor." We don't know if they were joking. That's part of the fun. Still, historians continue to debate whether certain marginalia were subtle commentaries on their owners. Was the armored snail meant to represent the cowardice of a particular patron? Was the fox dressed as a bishop a quiet jab at corrupt clergy? Or were they all just visual puns? We'll never really know. And that ambiguity? It's strangely comforting. You get to choose your own interpretation. So now you, bedtime traveler, are the newest audience. One that medieval scribes could never have predicted. Someone lying down at night, in the 21st century, whispering along with history to fall asleep. No candle, no cloak, just earbuds and curiosity. Let's wander for a moment into another kind of audience, the artists themselves. While most scribes worked anonymously, we do know a few names. One such figure is the wonderfully enigmatic Matthew Paris, a 13th century English monk who didn't just copy texts, he signed his work, illustrated maps, and added biting commentary in the margins. Sometimes, he even corrected other scribes' errors, in red ink, with insults. If medieval academia had a drama club, Matthew Paris would be president, director, and lead actor. Another possible artist is the mysterious Master of the Playing Cards, a 15th century figure credited with some of the earliest printed playing cards in Europe. Scholars still argue whether his whimsical suits of animals and knights drew direct inspiration from marginalia. The styles match. The humor aligns. The snails? Present. You start to see how blurred the lines were between sacred and silly. Even in the most devout manuscripts, psalters, gospels, apocalyptic texts, you might still find a goat on stilts or a nun with a catapult. The human brain craves play, even in the midst of reverence, especially in the midst of repetition. And now, thanks to that very human impulse, you're here, gently drifting off to sleep beside a parade of imaginary creatures no one intended to last this long. It's a lovely paradox. The more pointless the drawing seemed at the time, the more powerful it has become. Because what survives isn't always the official record, the straight-backed statue or solemn decree. Often, it's the scribbled joke, the marginal pun, the snail with a spear. And those things? They're what make history feel warm, intimate. Like someone across time is nudging your elbow and whispering, "Look at this. Isn't it ridiculous?" We also have to talk about marginalia's modern cousins. Because while medieval scribes had quills and vellum, today's students have notebooks, and what do they do during lectures? They doodle. Snakes in top hats. Cows on skateboards. Dragons taking midterms. And if you think we're so different from those ink-stained monks in Yorkshire or Poitiers or Cologne, think again. The platforms change, but the instinct stays. The need to personalize the margins. To play. To resist boredom with little flashes of personality. There's even a quiet art to falling asleep to this kind of history. It's not about snails. Not really. It's about giving yourself permission to pause, to leave logic behind for a while, to follow something gentle and a little absurd, something that doesn't need a deeper meaning. Because maybe the point of the snail duel was never satire or protest or moral allegory. Maybe it was just a tiny joke passed from one sleepy human to another, across 1,000 years of moonlit scribbling. You close your eyes for a second. Picture the scribe again. He dips his pen, curls the spiral of the shell, just so, adds a plume to the snail's helmet, smiles faintly to himself, and then he turns the page. So here you are, the last flicker of candlelight in the scriptorium of your mind. You've followed snail-charging knights, fox bishops, monkey doctors, and doodling monks through twisty corridors of parchment and memory. But before we let the ink dry completely, there's one last parchment to examine, a quiet postscript to the whole absurd story. The question remains, why snails? Sure, we've danced around the answers. Cowardice, absurdity, anti-knight satire, cosmic joke. But deep down, no theory has ever fully explained it. That's the frustrating, comforting truth. There is no master key, no papal decree about mollusks. Just a lot of very slow creatures doing battle in the margins. What we do know is that snails were familiar to medieval eyes. Unlike lions or camels, seen mostly in bestiaries or exotic trade tales, snails were everywhere. Slithering in gardens, chewing on monk-grown lettuce, leaving glistening trails across monastery paths. Maybe it's that very ordinariness that gave them comic power. Because nothing says absurd juxtaposition quite like placing the slowest, squishiest thing imaginable up against a noble knight in shining mail. It's David versus Goliath. If David had a shell and took 3 hours to show up. And remember, medieval humor loved inversion. Everything upside down. The peasant outwits the lord. The donkey gives a sermon. The nun fires a catapult. The snail wins the joust. It's not just humor, it's catharsis. It's a release valve for a world ruled by strict hierarchy and constant repetition. You begin to wonder, who's the joke really on? Could the snail be the scribe himself, slow-moving, burdened by tasks, armored in ink pots and rules, inching across folios with monkish patience? Or is the snail the reader? You, here and now, moving slowly, stubbornly through centuries of text, trying to make sense of it all, even as your brain starts to fog gently toward dreams. Historians still argue whether the recurring snail was pure parody or carried esoteric symbolism, but maybe it doesn't have to be either. Maybe it just made someone smile. And isn't that enough? We should also nod gently to the quiet resilience of marginalia as a form, not just as doodles, but as acts of resistance. Personalization, life carved into the edges of power. In a world where most people didn't get to write their own stories, margins became a place to speak, to play, to say, yes, this is holy and important and official, but also, here's a dog playing a harp. It's hard to imagine the monks realizing their sleepy sketches would one day be scanned, uploaded, and examined on glowing screens by people sipping oat milk lattes in cafes. Or by you, lying under covers, wondering how many medieval doodles are still hidden in books no one's yet opened. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, little ink ghosts in dusty corners. They're waiting. That's the beauty of this kind of history. It doesn't demand a conclusion. It just wants your attention for a while, like a bedtime story from a very odd uncle, or an ancient lullaby with extra verses about armored mollusks. And as your eyes start to soften, your limbs growing heavy, there's just one more image to leave you with. The scribe has finished his work for the day. He stretches, bones cracking quietly beneath a woolen robe. The candle's almost gone, casting long shadows across the page. He sets down his quill, blinks at the snail he just inked, complete with visor, lance, and a suspiciously smug expression. He laughs. Not a big laugh. Just a breath, a twitch of the lip. And that breath, that twitch, it floats down the centuries and reaches you. A tiny, shared joke between the living and the long gone. Now close your eyes. Let's sink slowly together into sleep. And now, as the ink settles and the parchment cools, let's wind down gently. You've wandered through manuscript halls and monkish dreams, glimpsed armored absurdities and lingering mysteries. Your breath should be slow now, your thoughts softening like vellum left under a warm cloth. The story never needed to make perfect sense. The snails didn't need a reason. That's the lovely secret of bedtime history. Sometimes, the details are simply there to cradle you, to offer a smile, a shrug, and a sense that human oddness spans centuries. Maybe you'll dream of margins tonight, of slow battles between silly creatures, of scribes giggling in candlelight, of a time when stories were drawn by hand, in quiet rebellion, one tiny joke at a time. You're safe here. The book is closed. The ink has dried. Sleep well, gentle traveler. Sweet dreams.